Tensions are peaking in the Caribbean, where the turquoise waters and sun-drenched islands now mask a brewing crisis that threatens to engulf the entire region. What was once a simmering rivalry has erupted into a high-stakes standoff, drawing the eyes of the world to the strategic crossroads between North and South America. The United States and Venezuela are locked in a confrontation that has been building for years, shaped by political mistrust, economic collapse, and a struggle for influence that extends far beyond their borders. The presence of military vessels and the tightening of border controls signal just how serious the situation has become. For Washington, President Nicolas Maduro's government is no longer just an isolated regime clinging to power. It is now viewed as a destabilizing force, one that threatens not only the fragile balance of the Caribbean, but also the security interests of the United States and its allies. The stakes have never been higher. The U.S. government accuses Maduro of turning Venezuela into a haven for powerful drug cartels, allowing criminal networks to operate with impunity. These groups, Washington claims, are using Venezuela as a launchpad to flood American streets with narcotics, transforming a political dispute into a full-blown national security emergency. The evidence, seized drugs, weapons, and high-profile arrests, fuels the urgency in Washington. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans in Caracas and beyond face a daily struggle for survival. Hyperinflation has rendered their currency nearly worthless. Store shelves are often bare, and long lines snake through the streets as people search for basic necessities. The humanitarian crisis deepens, with families forced to make impossible choices just to get by. In the halls of power in Washington, the mood is tense and urgent. Military leaders and policymakers gather behind closed doors, weighing their options and debating the risks of intervention. The possibility of direct military action, once unthinkable, is now openly discussed as a real and imminent scenario. Around the globe, newsrooms buzz with updates as the crisis in Venezuela dominates headlines. Analysts warn of ripple effects that could destabilize neighboring countries, disrupt global energy markets, and trigger a new wave of migration. The world watches, anxious and uncertain, as the rhetoric grows sharper and military posturing intensifies. What began as a slow-moving diplomatic chess match has transformed into a dangerous confrontation. Military convoys mobilize, fighter jets roar into the night sky, and soldiers prepare for deployment. The threat of intervention is no longer abstract. It is a looming reality that could ignite conflict at any moment. The question facing the world is no longer if the crisis will escalate, but when, and what the consequences will be for the Western Hemisphere. As the sun sets over Latin America, the region stands on the brink of a transformation that could reshape its future for generations to come. In November 2025, the world watched in disbelief as President Trump picked up the phone in the Oval Office and dialed a number that would send shockwaves across continents. This was not a routine diplomatic call, but a direct, stunning message to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, a move that would upend the fragile balance of power in the region. The message was blunt and uncompromising: resign and leave Venezuela with your family, or face consequences that would be swift and severe. For Maduro, the call was both a personal threat and a political earthquake, delivered without warning and with no room for negotiation. Safe passage was offered, but only if Maduro agreed to step down immediately. The terms were clear. There would be no drawn-out talks, no backroom deals. The United States was offering a single, narrow exit, and the clock was already ticking. This was no negotiation, but a final ultimatum, bypassing all traditional diplomatic channels. The usual intermediaries, ambassadors, envoys, and negotiators were left on the sidelines, as the highest levels of power spoke directly. The call sent shockwaves through both governments. In Caracas, officials scrambled to assess the threat, while in Washington, the message was clear: the era of sanctions and patient diplomacy was over. The United States was now prepared to act decisively, and the world was watching. Behind the scenes, the U.S. had already deployed its most advanced aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, along with a formidable naval force to the Caribbean. This was not a symbolic gesture. The ships were fully armed, their crews on high alert, and their presence unmistakable. The military buildup was unmistakable. Troops and equipment were being readied for action, and intelligence reports suggested that every move was being closely monitored. This was not a drill, but a real and present threat, designed to leave no doubt about American resolve. Warships, fighter jets, and surveillance aircraft now patrolled the Caribbean, their presence a constant reminder that the ultimatum was not just words. The skies and seas around Venezuela were alive with activity, making the threat feel immediate and inescapable. The diplomatic window was closing fast. Embassies began to prepare for evacuation and diplomats rushed to send urgent cables back home. Every hour that passed brought the region closer to a point of no return. The combination of a personal threat to Maduro and the overwhelming show of force pushed the crisis into a perilous new phase. On the streets of Caracas, tension was palpable as citizens watched events unfold with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Around the globe, leaders and ordinary people alike braced for what would come next. The world held its breath knowing that the next move could change the course of history in Venezuela and beyond. As U.S. warships gather, many wonder, will American troops invade Venezuela? Victoria Coates, a former Trump advisor, says a ground invasion isn't the preferred option. The military buildup is psychological pressure, meant to convince Maduro his only option is to step down. The threat of force is real, but the goal is political change without firing a shot. Still, the risk of escalation is high. Any misstep could trigger open conflict. The U.S. wants Maduro to believe time is running out, but the possibility of military action keeps everyone on edge. It's a high-stakes gamble, balancing coercion and the risk of war. The U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean is calculated coercion. The USS Gerald R. Ford's presence signals that the U.S. is ready to act, not just threaten. The show of force is designed to pressure Maduro and his military to reconsider their loyalty. It also isolates Maduro internationally, warning allies like Russia and China that the U.S. is serious. The deployment draws a line in the sand, complicating outside support for Caracas. For Trump, the fleet creates leverage, options from blockade to targeted strikes. This flexibility keeps the U.S. from being locked into one path. If diplomacy fails, the U.S. is ready to act. The clock is ticking for Maduro. A ground invasion is only one option and not the most likely. The U.S. could escalate with targeted sanctions on Venezuela's military elite, freezing assets and restricting travel. There's also a $25 million bounty on Maduro, incentivizing betrayal from within his circle. Intelligence operations could encourage a coup or defection, ending the standoff without U.S. troops. Another option, a special forces raid to capture Maduro, echoing the Noriega operation in Panama. Each scenario carries risks, but the strategy is flexible. Escalation can be ramped up or down. The White House has a range of tools, from financial pressure to covert action. Every step brings the U.S. and Venezuela closer to unpredictable confrontation. The next likely move: targeted U.S. airstrikes, not on government buildings, but on cartel infrastructure in Venezuela. The U.S. frames this as a counter-narcotics mission, not a war against Venezuela. Airstrikes could hit drug labs, jungle airstrips, and cartel command centers, aiming to cut off Maduro's financial lifeline. This strategy puts Maduro in a bind: defend the cartels and look complicit, or do nothing and appear weak. But airstrikes on another nation's soil are acts of war, risking civilian casualties and massive escalation. Any mistake could trigger a wider conflict. Maduro could retaliate against U.S. assets or crack down harder at home. What seems like a surgical option could ignite a much bloodier crisis. The U.S. frames Venezuela's drug trade as a national security threat, not just a law enforcement issue. With over 100,000 Americans dying annually from overdoses, the crisis is urgent. Washington accuses Maduro's regime of actively collaborating with cartels, turning Venezuela into a narco state. This narrative justifies a militarized response, painting Maduro as an enemy harming Americans. The issue moves from the DEA to the Department of War and National Security Council. Trump's team argues that record drug seizures and overdose deaths are evidence of an ongoing assault. This framing builds public support for military action. The administration claims it's defending the U.S., not just intervening abroad. Can the president order military action against Venezuela without Congress? The White House says yes, citing Article 2 of the Constitution and the need to defend the nation. By defining Venezuela's drug trade as an immediate threat, Trump claims authority to act unilaterally. This sidesteps lengthy congressional debates over war powers. Critics dispute this broad interpretation, but the administration is moving forward. The argument, stopping deadly drugs, outweighs the need for congressional approval. The president is prepared to use his full powers to resolve the crisis on his terms. As 2025 draws to a close, the standoff between the United States and Venezuela has reached a critical and dangerous tipping point. Tensions that have simmered for years are now boiling over, with both sides making moves that could change the fate of an entire region. President Trump's high-stakes gamble is clear. He aims to force regime change in Caracas, hoping to topple Nicolas Maduro's government without plunging the hemisphere into outright war. The world watches as American warships patrol the Caribbean, a show of force meant to intimidate but not yet provoke. Maduro, meanwhile, faces impossible choices. He could dig in and resist, rallying his loyalists and seeking support from foreign allies like Russia or China. Or, the threat of internal betrayal looms. His own inner circle might turn on him if the pressure becomes unbearable. There's also the possibility that Maduro could accept exile, fleeing the country and abruptly ending the crisis. Such a move would send shockwaves through Venezuela and beyond, but it might spare the nation from further bloodshed. For the United States, even a limited intervention carries enormous risks. The region is already fragile, and any escalation could trigger a massive refugee crisis, with thousands fleeing across borders. The economic fallout could be severe, especially if oil markets are disrupted, and America's allies in Latin America and Europe may be alienated by unilateral action. The Trump administration is betting on swift, decisive action to avoid a drawn-out conflict. But history offers sobering lessons. Past interventions, from Iraq to Libya, have often led to unintended consequences and long-term instability. The coming days are critical. Around the globe, journalists, diplomats, and ordinary citizens are glued to their screens, waiting for any sign of movement. Every decision made now will be scrutinized and could have far-reaching effects. The U.S. military is already in position, with equipment and personnel ready at key locations. Legal justifications have been prepared, and the administration has delivered its ultimatum to Maduro's government: step down or face the consequences. Whether these tense maneuvers will lead to a peaceful transition or erupt into open conflict remains uncertain. Diplomats are working behind the scenes, but the risk of miscalculation is high. Whatever happens next, the consequences will echo for years, shaping not only Venezuela's future, but the stability and politics of the entire Western Hemisphere.